George Britton Little was born into a wealthy family in Clay County, Kentucky around 1845 or 1846, with some pinpointing it to be June 19, 1845. His parents were David and Drusilla, and like his father, they encouraged him to pursue a career in law. However, his education was interrupted by the outbreak of the Civil War, and at the age of 18 he enlisted in the Confederate Army, only to be captured by the Union troops 4 months later. Paroled in December of 1863 with a promise not to oppose the North, George briefly returned to law school but soon succumbed to alcoholism to combat the memories of the war. He abandoned his legal studies, left Kentucky, and in 1867 moved to San Fernando Valley in California, where he adopted the name Dick Fellows. Occasionally also went by the name Richard Perkins. He said of his convictions, "To gratify my appetite for drinks, I began robbing stagecoaches." At this time, a man named Ed Clark tried to sway Dick away from criminal activities and brought him into his hog farming business. But despite initial success, Dick's ongoing battle with drink led him to squander his relationships, pushing him towards a life of crime. Dick carried out several successful robberies using a straightforward tactic. He would wait for stagecoaches to arrive in town and then threaten the driver with a pistol to hand over the express box, usually containing a few $100s. One night it took Dick 3 attempts to successfully rob a stagecoach, including 2 separate tries at different locations along the same route. The first 2, the drivers cracked the reins, forcing the 6-horse teams right past him when he stepped out, masked and armed, demanding they stop. Another time his horse bolted without him, following the stage, the first of many horse-related disasters. In January of 1870, while on the run as a recognized outlaw, Dick was confronted by the owner of a roadside eatery, pointing a pistol at him while he was eating. Dick pretended to surrender before trying to smack the gun away from the man, who fired a shot into his foot. Dick hobbled off and rode to the doctor's, where he was apprehended and sent to San Quentin prison. At 24, he was considered charming and managed to secure a job in the prison library. Here he gave lectures to the inmates, organized Sunday school classes, and taught Bible study. His conscientious work and positive influence on other prisoners led the prison officials to believe he had learned his lesson, and in April of 1874, after serving half of his 8-year sentence, he earned pardon from Governor Newton Booth. Upon his release, Dick attempted to find work, but his struggles with alcoholism persisted, leading him back to robberies. In November of 1875, while living in Caliente, Kern County, at the foot of the Tehachapi Mountains, the Southern Pacific Railroad was blasting a path through the area. Dick devised a plan for what could have been one of the largest stagecoach robberies in California history, targeting a Wells Fargo shipment of $240,000 in gold bars, overseen by Chief Special Officer J.B. Hume. Dick and a partner rented horses and were supposed to ride cross-country to meet each other at the pre-arranged rendezvous. However, the borrowed horse threw Dick off, knocking him unconscious for several hours and causing him to miss his chance. It happened for the better, as Hume had spotted Dick casing the stage earlier in the day and was waiting with his officers. Dick had to walk back to town and never saw his partner again. Dick planned another robbery of the same stagecoach on its return trip about a week later. He confronted the driver and this time made off with the strongbox. However, he soon realized he had no way to open it. The original Wells Fargo strongbox was constructed from pine and oak, reinforced with iron straps, and could weigh up to 150 pounds when fully loaded. Dick tried to escape with the strongbox by loading it onto his horse, but the horse got spooked and ran off, leaving him stranded in the desert with the heavy load. Remembering that the railroad had small tunnels nearby, Dick scrambled to escape on foot in the dark, heaving the gold-laden chest off the road and into the bushes. Unfortunately, he had inadvertently plunged himself 12 to 18 feet deep into a trench and broke his leg above the ankle. It was Tunnel 5, which had recently been excavated by the Southern Pacific Railway. His foot was also partially crushed by the strongbox, either when it initially fell off the horse or when Dick tumbled over the edge with it. Amazingly, despite his broken leg, Dick managed to hobble to a Chinese laborer's camp where he stole some tools and splintered his leg. Early the next morning, he stole an axe from one of the Chinese railroad workers and broke open the box, finding 1,800, equivalent to approximately 50,000 in today's dollars. He fashioned himself a pair of crutches from a tree limb and went to a farm he had seen earlier. There he stole a horse and took off. When Detective Hume heard about the Wells Fargo holdup, he headed for Caliente. On the way, he encountered the young son of the rancher whose horse Dick had stolen. "I'm tracking down the thief," the boy told Hume. "So am I," the detective replied. "It will be easy as pie," the boy said. "Pa ran out of horseshoes, so he tacked on a mule's shoe." The Wells Fargo detective tracked Dick down by the unique sign left by the horse he had stolen, and Dick was captured a few days later near Bakersfield. Dick's boot had to be cut off his swollen leg for treatment. He was placed in a hospital until his leg healed, then tried for his crime, found guilty, and sentenced to 8 years. "I'll try to live honestly within the pale of society," he told a detective. But while waiting to be transported to San Quentin, Dick escaped using a new pair of crutches. He made his way to a farm and stole a horse without a saddle. After leading it to another farm, Dick went inside a barn to fetch a saddle. When he came out with the saddle and new crutches, he spooked that horse, which reared, snapped the rope, and bolted for home. Dick refused to give up, waiting until the farmer left the house. He told the farmer's wife he was a lost traveler. She invited him in and fed him. When the farmer returned, his wife told him about the lovely young man on crutches. That night he was arrested and readily admitted to stealing the horse, but denied any involvement in the holdup. He was taken to jail and over $1,000 was found on him. Despite intense questioning, he maintained his innocence. With no further evidence, Hume left for San Francisco and Dick was charged with horse theft. While waiting to be taken to Folsom, he jumped on his jailer from a shelf in his cell, stole his revolver, and ran out of the jail. 2 blocks from the prison, he spied a horse tethered to graze in a field. He pulled loose the rope, looped it around the horse's nose, leapt astride, and galloped away. But after running a short distance, the animal began to buck, and Dick hit the dirt out cold. Later, while en route to Folsom, he learned that the horse he had tried to ride was recuperating from eating loco weed and was tethered out to prevent harm. Dick was finally arrested again in a cabin near San Jose, where he was reading a long, detailed account of his escape as it appeared in the San Jose Mercury. A few days later, Dick requested writing materials and asked Hume to come down, confessing to the stage robbery. Once again, Dick became a model prisoner and got his old job back at the library, perhaps due to the lack of alcohol. He taught basic education and Spanish to his fellow inmates. After serving 5 years, Governor George Perkins pardoned him in 1881, and Dick was freed in July. In May of that year, Dick took a job as a newspaper man on the Santa Cruz Echo under his birth name. There he sold advertising and supposedly taught Spanish on the side. His side line was a bit more interesting. Dick would often absent himself from his job for a day or two, ride down to Soledad and inspect a situation. After a bit, he'd get wind of a shipment that he thought looked promising and make a try for it. Meanwhile, Hume observed the familiar pattern of robbery attempts and had his description printed along with Dick's picture, posting it in Soledad, Gonzales, and the other towns along the line. When the wanted posters appeared in Santa Cruz, Dick, as the advertising solicitor of the Santa Cruz Echo, decided it was time to try his talents elsewhere. To throw Hume off the track, he had his carpetbag shipped to Soledad, but then took off on foot along the coast toward San Francisco. Charles All, a special officer employed by Wells Fargo and Company, left his home in Modesto and began searching for Dick Fellows, knowing the following details. On the night of December 20th, the upstage from Santa Barbara was robbed by one man about 5 miles south of Arroyo Grande in San Luis Obispo County. On the night of January 2nd, 1882, an attempt was made to stop the downstage between the same points, 2 miles north of Los Alamos in Santa Barbara County, by one man. The driver escaped after one shot had been fired at him by the robber. On the night of January 8, 1882, the downstage between the same points was stopped by one man on horseback about 5 miles north of Los Alamos in Santa Barbara County. The stage driver, George Richmond, was also robbed of a gold watch and a gold-linked chain, the value of $150. On the same night, a bay mare, no brand, and a saddle and a bridle were stolen from T. Hicks near the scene of the robbery. He was armed with a nickel-plated pistol, and on the night of January 14, 1882, the downstage from Soledad to San Luis Obispo was robbed by one man near Plato in Monterey County. All followed Dick for some weeks before he was able to learn of his exact whereabouts. He would receive a dispatch stating that his man was at one place, and before he could get there, Dick would be off. But gradually the chase drew to a close, and on Thursday night Dick stopped at Murphy's, and yesterday morning he started afoot toward Mayfield. On his way he was overtaken by two men. He hitched a ride in a wagon. "I guess you'll go with us," they said upon recognizing him. They delivered him to Constable Van Buren, who passed him along to Constable Burke of Santa Clara on January 27, 1882. Arriving here, the prisoners expressed a desire for a drink, and before going to the jail, they stopped at a saloon under the Arguello house. Dick called for brandy and managed to pour out an extra large horn in spite of his handcuffs. As Constable Burke was whispering to the bartender that his companion at the bar was none other than Dick Fellows, the famous stage robber, Dick whacked him with his manacled hand and ran off. Upon reaching the sidewalk, Dick darted around the corner and down St. John Street toward Market. Burke was taken by surprise, but he at once followed on the run. He drew his pistol and fired, but the shot failed to take effect, and Dick succeeded in getting out of sight. The barkeeper, in the meantime, had heard the noise, and he at once came out and gave pursuit. When running by the Minnesota house, Dick stumbled and fell, but he immediately sprang up, leaving his hat and shawl behind. Chief Haskell and Detective All were at once notified of the escape, and officers and citizens started in search of the fugitive. No less than 50 people looked for him. A Spanish-speaking man stated that he had met him near the bridge on San Augustine Street and that Dick told him not to come close or he would shoot. Another individual saw a person near Stager's Pottery who had something over his head and carried his hands near his breast. It was evident that Dick had draped his coat over his head. Dick hid out under the hay of a barn owned by Dr. Gunkel, where he was found by the smell of bad whiskey. However, he claimed to be a tramp and was bareheaded with his hands in his pockets. Dr. Gunkel and his neighbor, Mr. Edwards, thought the wanted poster matched his description, age 36, scars, brown hair, light brown whiskers, and possibly handcuffed hidden in his pockets. Dr. Gunkel said, "Have you hurt your arm?" The man raised his elbows to show that he had two arms but kept his hands in the pockets. Mr. Edwards then asked, "Have you no hat?" To which he answered, "No, I went down to this town here and got drunk. That is my failing. And I think some of the boys played a trick on me and pulled off my hat." But when the doctor left to alert the authorities, Dick disappeared, leaving only open bottles and food cans he scavenged from the doctor's cellar. Dick continued to hide where he could and was seen walking up the narrow-gauge railroad. He was eventually captured again in Santa Barbara on March 8, 1882, where he was examined on a charge of robbing the Los Alamos stage on January 8th. The witnesses for the people were George Richmond, the driver of the stage, Constable Burke of Santa Clara, and Detective J.B. Hume. Richmond identified the watch taken from Dick at Mayfield, and Burke and Hume testified that Dick admitted that he took the watch from Richmond at the time the Los Alamos stage was robbed. In April, George X. Sherman, the deputy sheriff, left Dick out of his cell as usual to wash and exercise while he went to breakfast. Chinese cook called him from the table, saying the prisoner's breakfast was ready. Sherman opened the door to let the meals in and saw Dick crouched on top of his cell. Dick jumped on Sherman, forcing him down, and grabbed his revolver. Sherman called the cook to lock the outside door, but he didn't respond. Another prisoner locked the door but was driven away by Dick, who then escaped. Dick ran through the alley and picked up a horse but was bucked off and continued on foot. He was eventually recaptured after a chase. Captain Shields and others helped cover Dick with pistols. Surrounded by armed citizens, he returned the pistol and, as one newspaper reported, lit a cigarette and lounged back to jail as cool as a cucumber on ice. Dick had been convicted of 1 count of robbery and 1 count of theft, with the prior conviction for twice holding up the stagecoach that ran between Santa Barbara and San Luis Obispo. He was finally transported to Folsom Prison. He feverishly wrote letters advocating for his pardon, pledging to stop his criminal ways. When an inmate was killed in an 1889 accident at the quarry, Dick requested a funeral service for the man. Remarkably, after nearly 40 years in prison, Dick was pardoned by Governor James Gillette in 1908, marking the end of his criminal career. Wells Fargo and Company suspected Dick committed up to 12 robberies between 1869 and 1882. He visited Santa Barbara one last time in 1915, and according to some reports, he changed his name and relocated to another state, where he taught Sunday school and wrote for magazines. Others say he went back to live with his wealthy family in Kentucky. Strong evidence suggests he did live out his days in Kentucky as a schoolteacher, dropping his pseudonym. Some speculate he died January 2nd, 1924, at the age of 78. This has been Biographies of the West. My name is Lorin Morgan-Richards. Thanks for watching.